Bye-bye.
Okay, well, we are going to move on to our next speaker here then. I'm excited to introduce, not the person who just talked, let me get the right script up here in front of me. I'm pleased to announce and introduce Dr. Ashley D'Antonio, who is an assistant professor in nature-based recreation management at Oregon State University. Yay, go Bears. Bears, oh no, I said my own school. Sorry, it's supposed to be go Beavs. I'm never gonna live that one down. Okay. My football team is Bears. Okay, how about that? She is a recreation ecologist and uses interdisciplinary and spatially based approaches such as GPS and GIS to understand visitor behaviors and the ecological consequences of those behaviors in parks and protected areas. Dr. D'Antonio strives to advance visitor use management research while also providing park and protected area managers with useful new knowledge and tools that can be applied across spatial scales. This is neat. She's got to see and work in some different places, including in national parks across the West, including the Grand Teton, Yellowstone, Yosemite, Joshua Tree, and Rocky Mountain National Parks, and has also worked in urban proximate protected areas in Orange County, California, and national forests in Oregon and Colorado. Not too bad. Welcome, Dr. Antonio, and we're excited to hear what you have to say today. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. And based on our last presentation about health, I am getting over a cold, so I apologize for my voice today, and I'll probably be pausing to take some drinks of water to make sure I can make it through all right. But I'm really excited today to hopefully introduce some of you to the field of recreation ecology and discuss how we can use recreation ecology as a way to think about how humans interact with nature and interact with their environment, including our forested landscapes. So I want to just this is probably not surprising to folks, especially folks in the Pacific Northwest, but a lot of folks enjoy participating in outdoor recreation and enjoying our open spaces and public lands. This is a figure that comes out about every year from the Outdoor Foundation, their outdoor participation report, where they survey folks in the US to see how many folks participated in outdoor recreation in the previous year. And this is defining outdoor recreation broadly. So this is not just going to your national parks and those big epic trips. This can be visiting local neighborhoods and local green spaces. And so this is defining recreation very broadly, which I appreciate. And in 2020, they found that over half of all folks in the United States participated in some form of outdoor recreation. So that's a lot of people getting outside and enjoying our public lands and our natural environments, which is excellent. We definitely want that for all the amazing health reasons and great benefits we can gain from that. However, one of the basic things we know in recreation ecology is that if we permit outdoor recreation in these landscapes, that some degree of disturbance and impact is inevitable. And this is a cartoon meant to be a little bit funny. This is an illustration by Michael Byers for an article for talking about public lands in Colorado and how much use they were seeing. But we can have different impacts to different aspects of the environment, as well as to the social environment as well. And these impacts can be things like trampling of vegetation. It can result in the formation of trails that maybe land managers don't want. In this image here, this is an informal trail, a trail that visitors have created. If you see my feet here, that's a designated trail that was created by these public land managers, but people sometimes don't go where you expect. These the vegetation loss can sometimes then cascade into other impacts like soil loss, soil compaction, impacts to tree roots, which can cascade even further into impacts to water quality. We can also have what I call as more direct or depreciative impacts, such as the cutting down or carving in trees when you're not supposed to, depreciative behavior like feeding of wildlife, like we see in this example here. This was a squirrel in Zion that someone handed an apple core to. Not the best thing. We can also have sometimes indirect impacts. So even just having recreation on the landscape and the trails and roads that we use to access these natural areas can cause fragmentation and connectivity issues, which I'll talk about a little bit later. We can have things like harassment to wildlife or wildlife kind of gets stressed out just from being too close to recreationists. We can have impacts related to pollution and pathogens, sometimes from motorized recreation. It can also be from folks disposing of their human waste improperly. So the overall story here is that we can have impacts to recreation and disturbance to all different aspects of the ecosystem. And as we know, because these ecosystems are interconnected, we can have cascading effects at times. And even though my work really focuses on these ecological aspects and the disturbance of recreation can have to ecosystems, we don't want to forget the social aspects as well. So when we think about recreation management, oftentimes we're thinking about those ecosystem components, but we can also have impacts to the social environment. So we can have impacts related to crowding. We can have impacts related to noise. We can have impacts from conflict. And so as I'm talking today and really focusing on this ecological aspects, I'll try and touch on some of the social aspects of outdoor recreation management in open space and natural areas as well. So again, my goal of today is to introduce you to recreation ecology research. And so I gave you some of the basic background information about outdoor recreation and how we think about outdoor recreation as a potential disturbance. Again, still a great thing. We want people to do it, but we want to understand how it interacts with natural environment. So recreation ecology, my field of study, is the study of the environmental consequences of outdoor recreation or nature-based tourism. And importantly, it's also how to think about that effective management. So our previous speaker made a really good point. We put our publications out there, but is it actually used? I really want to make sure that the work what we're doing is informing management on the ground of these environments to make sure we can meet our conservation goals and other land management goals that we may have, as long as meeting our objectives related to having folks out there enjoying nature and providing opportunities for outdoor recreation. One of the things I love about my field of study is that I combine social and ecological sciences. I have a couple examples of that today. And as I mentioned, it is also incredibly applied. So my goal in the couple of studies I'm showing is to really emphasize how managers use this information to make some decisions. So last slide in my 5-minute recreation ecology introduction, then I'll launch into some studies for you. When we're thinking about recreation as a potential disturbance on the landscape, if we're trying to understand what that impact might be, how much impact are we going to see and where is it occurring? There's a few different factors that I've put around the outside of this, this purple circle that we can measure on the landscape to better understand what those impacts might be. Some of these are social, which I put in that kind of light blue color, and some of these are ecological or biophysical, which I've put in kind of that green color. So from a social standpoint, how visitors behave in a landscape can really influence the impact they have. So if everyone is out there following leave no trace principles and always throwing their garbage where it should be and disposing of their waste properly and not harassing wildlife, the impacts are going to be a lot different if everyone's out there just kind of doing whatever they feel like, right? So that behavior piece is really important. The timing of visitor use. So certain ecosystems and certain aspects of the ecosystems are more or less sensitive to recreation disturbance at different times of the year. So, in the Pacific Northwest, where it's super, super rainy in the winter, some places might close trails totally or close them to slightly more impactful activities like biking during the time that the trails are wet. And during, breeding season for wildlife species, they may be more sensitive to recreation disturbance than during other times of the year. So that timing of the visitor use is also really important for understanding the level of impact or disturbance we might see. The level of visitor use is important, how many people are out there. What they're doing, the type of visitor use is also important. Again, is it hiking or mountain biking? Is it horse packing or packing in with goats and llamas? Is it a motorized activity or non-motorized activity? Not to say that any of these things are good or bad, that's not what we're really evaluating, but those impacts that they have are going to vary. And then from the ecosystem perspective, our ecosystem type is something we want to understand. So I tried to bring examples today from forested landscapes, but I currently have a study in Capitol Reef National Park in southern Utah, where one of the things they're really concerned about is impacts to biological soil crust. And that's a really sensitive ecosystem and component of an ecosystem that's a lot different than some other ecosystems, which might not be as sensitive. And then the current environmental conditions, which is basically how impacted is already. Are we opening a new place to recreation use? Or are we trying to understand a place that's had recreation use for a very long period of time? And so understanding all of these different factors and measuring them can help us predict the level of environmental impact that we see. And we can also manage for all these different things on the outside bubbles to help us, again, kind of mitigate recreation impact or disturbance if we find it at a level that is unacceptable. So there's your background. We're going to move into 2 example studies, and I'm not going to dig into the methods too deeply of these today. I really want to highlight what we found and how it was applied to help manage these landscapes. So I'm going to start with a study from Grand Teton National Park. And this one I wanted to highlight because it really shows how we can combine some social and ecological data to help better manage basically a forested lake system in Grand Teton. And then the second study that I'll present is a paper where we pulled data from a few different national parks to look at how recreation use manifests on a landscape at different spatial scales and what that means for management. So our first study, we're going to take a little virtual field trip to Wyoming, to Grand Teton National Park. And if you've been there before, you may be familiar with this lake here, Jenny Lake. We're going to go just a little north of there today. But I do want to acknowledge my collaborators on this project. As I mentioned, a lot of my work is very interdisciplinary. Recreation ecology is very interdisciplinary. And so I worked with a number of people on this project, both at Penn State, who are some of the folks you see in this picture, and Chris Mons at Utah State, who's my former PhD advisor. And these are our 2 amazing grad students on the projects. Some of you may recognize this person here. This is Jenna Baker. She worked with me for a master's degree, and she's now the Recreation and Engagement Program Manager for OSU Research Forests. And this was one of the projects she worked on for her master's. And Will Rice was a social scientist grad student on the project. He's now at University of Montana. So we are going to head to Stringenly Lakes. This is a really popular lake destination in Grand Teton that had been seeing increasing recreation use within the past few years. And park managers were really concerned about how rapidly use was increasing. As I said, if you've been to Grand Teton, you may be familiar with Jenny Lake. Stringenly Lake are just north. String is a smaller lake. Lee's a pretty larger lake with some backcountry campsites. And one of the things that's really great about this lake is that it's easily accessible from 3 different parking lots. And because String Lake is so small and narrow and shallow, it's a really great place to kind of take families for swimming. There's not a lot of wave action. So if you've got a stand-up paddleboard or you're a new canoe or a kayaker, it's a pretty safe lake to recreate on compared to Jenny Lake, which can get pretty windy. And along the shoreline of this lake, there's a variety of hiking trails. It's just a really great recreation destination. So we were brought in by Grand Teton National Park to help them understand how visitors are using, experiencing, and impacting the shorelines of String and Lee Lake. And as I mentioned, this was a large collaborative team because we took an interdisciplinary approach to understand these questions that the park managers had. Again, use was increasing. They were concerned about both impacts to the social environment and impacts to the ecosystem. So from an ecological standpoint, we did an inventory of the recreation impacts that were occurring in this area, and we'll present some findings from that. We really want to understand that visitor behavior piece. So my favorite tool is to use GPS tracking of visitors, borrowed it from wildlife, except instead of darting them and collaring them, we ask people's permission to carry a GPS unit. They do it voluntarily, and we can see exactly where people went during their recreation visit to this landscape. And then we did also have a social science survey that visitors took when they got to the area, and they carried a GPS unit with them. And when they came back, they returned their GPS unit and took another survey about how their experience was. And so this kind of 3-tiered approach allowed us to answer a whole lot of different manager questions, but I'm only going to present results from a couple today. So one of the things that we found was that visitors were coming to Grand Teton National Park and specifically to the Stringenly Lake area to find a sense of escape, which basically means to kind of get away from the trappings of everyday life, to kind of have a little bit of solitude, you know, to maybe experience some of those mental health benefits that we can get from spending time in nature. But when we asked visitors after their visit, did you find escape? So the visitors who told us, yeah, I came here to find escape, I want solitude. And then we surveyed them when they left and they said, did you find it? Did you get that sense of escape? About 22% of the visitors said they didn't. They came here to achieve something and they were unable to achieve it in this area. Now, that might not seem like a very large percent, but the Park Service were really concerned about making sure visitors are having quality experiences. And so we wanted to dig into this a little bit more. This is one of the higher percentages in terms of these outcomes that visitors said they wanted to come to experience and didn't. So what we found is that if we looked at the behaviors of these people who said, oh, I came here to find escape and I did not find what I came here for, their behavior in this landscape was different. So as I said, we GPS tracked everybody. This graph is just, those figures just showing you a point cloud of where everybody went. So the darker the orange, the more people there were that visited that area during our sampling. And we did give GPS units to people in canoes and kayaks and stand-up paddleboards. So that's why you're seeing the lakes are completely covered. That's not like people swimming with them. What we found was that visitors who were able to escape behave differently than visitors that were not able to find escape. And I know it's hard to see in these maps, so I'm going to pull out kind of the spatial statistics we calculated. So visitors who came out of their experience at Stringley Lake and said, I found that sense of escape, they traveled further and stayed longer, which that is a little interrelated, in the Stringley Lake system than people who said, oh, I came here and I didn't find that sense of solitude. And most of the folks who were unable to find a sense of escape stuck to this tiny little eastern shoreline, about half a mile of trail. They really spent most of their time right here along, kind of within proximate to those parking areas. So we were able to find a behavioral difference between kind of how people behaved and the motivations and whether they achieved them. So we know there's something going on in that eastern shoreline. We know that there's a lot of visitor use. They're coming here for a variety of motivations. We saw some social impacts. Now we wanted to understand the ecological impacts. So what is the level and extent of visitor disturbance along this area? When I talk about visitor disturbance, I'm talking about things like here in this left-hand picture, vegetation loss, soil erosion. We have a fair bit of exposed roots. This is pretty, a little bit extreme in some areas. The formation of social trails, like we can see here in this right-hand photo. So what we did, and really this was Jenna, went out and mapped every ecological impact that we could see and attribute to recreationists in the system. And when we zoom in, this is kind of what this data looks like. The darker the red, the more impacted it is, meaning the more vegetation loss and the more potential soil erosion that we're seeing. So darker red means more impact to soil and veg. So if we look at that, we can see a lot of kind of red and orange social trails and kind of sites that visitors have created. And we also documented locations of tree damage. I know it's kind of hard to tease that out, but if we summarize it all, we found that there was 1.7 miles of visitor created trails and about 51,000 square feet of visitor created sites, which might be hard to visualize. But if we're thinking in terms of American football field, that is almost a whole football field plus a little bit of an end zone. So we're subtracting out an end zone and a half. And if we put all that impacted area together, that's how much we'd have. And most of these sites were of our higher level condition classes. Remember, the ones where we have more vegetation and soil impact. So really high intensity impact. But one of the stories we told managers, and I'll talk about this in a second, is that impact was heavily concentrated. So we had a lot of impact, but it was only occurring in that same, which makes sense, that same like half a mile of trail right close proximate to the parking lots. So we didn't have a lot of impact through the rest of the trail system and barely any on the western side of this lake. So this was the data that we collected and gave to managers. And one of the key messages is that both social and ecological impacts were potentially high in intensity, but only in certain areas, only along that shoreline. So if people were able to get further out in the system, they might experience escape, that we'd have less impacts. So one of my colleagues on this project, I won't name who, it wasn't Jenna, said, well, let's just disperse people in the system. That'll give people more opportunities for escape. And I came back as a recreation ecologist and said, no, that's going to disperse our ecological impact. What if we manage expectations about what you can actually experience here at Stringley Lake? And let's concentrate use into those areas that are already heavily impacted where we might not do any additional impact. And so, as we think about how to manage both social and ecological impacts, there can sometimes be kind of a push and pull where the solution for the social impact might cause more ecological disturbance. And so we need to think about how to balance these two things. So there's kind of a rapid fire summary of a 3-year study, but hopefully you can see how the data we collected was able to help us make some very specific management recommendations and how to think about that social and ecological aspect of recreation management. So the next study was really focusing on this idea of scale and thinking about recreation at a landscape before we really looked at one small lake system, which is important, but very much at the human scale. So this study, we kind of broaden out a little bit when we think about these recreation disturbances. And this was a paper that was published in 2017 in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment with Kevin Gutzweiler and Chris Mons. And we really wanted to understand if we could use tools from other fields of science to really think about recreation disturbance more broadly. Because again, a lot of our studies are at the human scale, which is not the same scale that a moose, for example, might be experiencing their environment, which is also different from the scale that like a butterfly or a lizard might be experiencing their environment. So how recreation manifests as a disturbance, again, is dependent on what component of the ecosystem we're thinking about. But most of our studies really focus at that human scale. And so we wanted to borrow concepts from landscape ecology and apply them to recreation. So we wanted to look at how recreation might impact things like habitat connectivity and how recreation might influence things like habitat fragmentation. So we took some of our recreation data, our GPS tracking data, and our mapping of those resource impacts, like I showed previously, and basically turned them into a landscape attribute. So where on the landscape were we seeing different levels of habitat disturbance, either high levels or low levels of use, or high levels or low levels of recreation impacts? And then go through these next findings pretty quickly because they just illustrate a couple of points and specifically highlight lessons learned. So when we look at data from Rocky Mountain National Park and Teton National Parks, a bunch of different parks that we studied, we found that recreation disturbance overall made up a small percentage of these areas. If we look at a corridor level or a watershed level, it was anywhere from 1% to 2% in a lot of these locations. We also found that because of the patterns in the landscape, the way they're driven by our infrastructure like roads and trails, there were locations where wildlife species could find refuges from recreation disturbance. So areas where there was no recreation disturbance at all. And one of my master's students has taken these and applied these to looking at bird species in Orange County. We found the same thing. Even in a fairly small protected area, there are pockets of habitat where these species can get a break from recreation disturbance. However, the location of the recreation disturbance is still really important. In one of our study areas in Acadia National Park, we were looking at impacts of mountain summits. And areas above tree line back east are really rare. They're a really special type of ecosystem. And at this particular mountain summit, recreation was taking up the entire area of that important habitat. So even though it was a small percentage, the habitat we were interested in was also relatively small and there was perfect overlap. So there could be cause for concern there. And lastly, that pattern on the landscape is really important. So if we're looking about how recreation might impact connectivity, we need to really understand how recreation overlays with different patches of habitat. And in Rocky Mountain National Park, we found that there was a 10 to 12% decrease in connectivity from this particular pattern of recreation use to habitat that was important for elk species. And a postdoc of mine, Dr. Evan Bredenwig, is applying this to some other recreation areas now, looking at the same connectivity question. So to wrap us up, and then I hopefully save some time for questions, this study really looked at that understanding recreation, not just at the human scale, but at the scale of whatever ecosystem components are important to you, is important for effective protected area management. The human scale is important, but we need to also think what aspect of the ecosystem are we really concerned about, and how do we scale our data appropriately? Visitor use patterns, not just use levels, are also really important. Where recreationists are on the landscape and what habitat components they're interacting with is going to help us better understand this disturbance and what we need to be concerned about. And further research is needed. That paper from 2017 was the first paper that really looked at this. There was a couple other studies that had done a little bit around fragmentation, but we're hoping to kind of continue this broader scale research looking at recreation, ecology, and disturbance. So my key take homes for you today, if you remember anything from our talk, is that it's not just about how many recreationists are on the landscape, but where they are and when they're there. Understanding social and ecological components are incredibly important. And we don't want to forget that visitor surveys and understanding our visitors and ensuring we're providing quality experiences is another important key component. So that's what I've got for you. There's my contact information. You have questions after this, but hopefully you learned something about recreation ecology today and how it can be applied to land management.
Okay, thank you so much, Ashley. That was
Yeah.
really exciting, and I certainly learned a lot. This is an area that I am, lacking information in. I thank you so much. That was so thorough, and I love seeing your pictures. And I just have to say, if you ever need a field assistant, and I'm happy to volunteer my
Hey,
time.
hear that a lot.
You probably get that a lot. You said you get that a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, we don't have any questions here right now, but I think that's just so interesting today because I mean, just picking up on some themes that I've heard today, where we heard earlier, where science is in this phase of, nature or science, nature, sorry, as disturbance, and just how much disturbance does impact something as well as recreation sciences. I mean, can you talk a little bit more about that, like just these disturbance impacts? So you're looking at this, but I mean, maybe can you describe some other broader impacts that you might be seeing here?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my studies really focus on like vegetation and soil impacts, but we're seeing a lot of one of the things that we're seeing is as recreation uses increase so rapidly, we haven't had a similar rapid increase in research and staffing and funding to help manage the recreation. So we're seeing a lot of recreation managers and public land managers feeling a little overwhelmed and feeling like they can't be as proactive in their management as maybe they could have when use was not increasing as much. And we've seen that here in Oregon on the coast, like having to close restrooms because they can't keep up with the cleaning and litter. And so we're at like, I feel like a really important point where recreation, a lot of people participating, which is amazing, but our research and our staffing has not kept up with that. And so it's really hard to manage if you don't have that science-based information to inform your management, and you don't have the staff to help, enforce your management actions.
Great. Thank you so much. And I won't keep you on the spot here too much. We do have a little bit more wiggle room, but I'm going to keep firing. I'll ask the panel too if they want to unmute here. Oh, great. I always can depend on Stephen Weldon to ask some questions here. But I do want to come back to one for you if I can remember if we have some time. Okay. Thank you. So how do you balance dispersing versus concentration of visitors to protect the environment and satisfy visitors?
Yeah, great question. So dispersing versus concentrating. So a lot of it does have to do with use level. I mentioned use is like part of the story. But if you have really low use levels, like we were thinking about like Alaska wilderness areas, it can be better to disperse use so you don't have repeated use in the same area to cause that impact. It gives the ecosystems time to recover. And it does depend a little bit on the ecosystem type. Really concentrating use is often used in that String Lake example I gave, where the damage has already been done. Use probably isn't going to decrease. So it's better to harden and get visitors to use the hardened trails, the hardened sites, the stuff where they're going to be, and to concentrate it so you are creating those refuges essentially where there is less impact for wildlife and vegetation. So use level is part of it, and then you do want to think about like how sensitive your ecosystem is. So that's a great question that we wrestle with a lot in recreation ecology.
Great. Thank you so much. And there aren't any here right now. So, I was just curious, and I'll have to read your work more. I'm excited to do that too. I have a big list of reading from today. So I'll add this one here too. So, curious about some of your work that you do where you monitored people's expectations. I thought that was really interesting and how fun to like be visiting one of those places and get a GPS and just, get to travel that around. I think that would be kind of fun to see where it goes. I'm just curious, did you ask, have you asked the question in any of your work, how about knowledge of nature or like natural systems and stuff and how much that impacts their expectations?
Yeah, not so much in expectations, but I am interested, and I did a little bit of work for my master's looking at people's knowledge of the local environment impacted whether they saw the resource impacts and whether it impacted them. And local knowledge and experience, how long you've been coming to a place over and over, were factors that influenced whether or not you also saw the social trails that other people created or you noticed the soil was eroded. And so there isn't a lot of work showing if folks don't have that knowledge, how much it influences their experience. But people do tend to, if they've been to a place over and over and they have that knowledge, to at least see those things. But generally, if you ask people if they had a good trip, people generally do pretty well, which is why we asked about like, what did you come here for? And how much did you experience what you came here for? So, but yeah, good question. Those social science constructs are tricky.
Yeah. Thank you. And Fitz has a question. Go ahead, Fitz.
Yeah, Fitz.
Yeah, how you doing, Ashley? I couldn't put it in the chat, but what kind of studies have you seen on the impact of recreation on wildlife? And it could be a deer or any of those that are that you know of that are specific that would be of interest?
Yeah, great question. So there's been a big uptick in research interest related to recreation and wildlife. There's been a few studies looking at where we experimentally send people down trails and send bikes down trails and see how the wildlife respond. There's been some studies to look at if wildlife change their behavior, become more diurnal from the recreation use. Generally, what we find is that wildlife will sometimes shift their patterns away from recreation, trails, and roads. But it's very species dependent, even individual dependent. So some species might adjust. One of the big things that's coming out of the wildlife research is if use is predictable, it can be less of an impact to wildlife. So that's why off-trail travel is more disruptive to wildlife than folks that stick to the trail, because that's an unpredictable activity. Introducing a new activity type, like never having motorized use, for example, again, I'm not picking on motorized use, just as an example. If you've never had motorized use and you suddenly allow, OHVs into your system, you're going to see an uptick in disturbance because that's a new activity type that they've not been able to adjust to. So I don't know if that exactly answered your questions. I've done some work looking at visitor behavior and how that shifts wildlife's use of areas. But we're kind of on the cusp of new stuff. Yeah, go ahead.
The reason I asked is because during COVID at the beginning, we closed the McDonald Dunn Forest for over a month. And I saw more deer than I ever have. Anyway, I just thought that because people weren't out there moving them around and, their avoidance patterns, that's why I asked. So thanks.
Yeah, and I do know there's not a meta study, but a bunch of people are collected a bunch of GPS tracks from wildlife, and there's a study right now where researchers are working on combining that from pre and post COVID. So I'll be sure to send you that paper when it comes out. I was not involved, but I've heard rumors of it. So.
Great, thank you. We have one more question. I think we can get in here before we have our raffle, and then it's going to be break time here at 2:30. So we'll have some time to get up and move around for 15 minutes and take care of what you need to take care of. This is from Amanda Sullivan Astor. Are education opportunities being maximized in your opinion? So she says, be that for disturbance or forest management near recreation activities and the connection of funds from active management to road maintenance and other activities in the woods, perhaps?
Yeah, I think the education piece is not 100% in my wheelhouse, but I do think there's more opportunities to educate recreationists about working forests and other activities that are happening on our lands, and to educate them on the best way to behave. The hard part with education is that we find that just having signs out there doesn't really work. And so that face-to-face communicating with people is really the best way to educate folks. So I always think there's more opportunities to educate recreationists, and often they're eager to learn. They just don't want to stand there and read a sign. So thinking about creative ways to engage people might be helpful. So hopefully that answered your question. I appreciate that question.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley. Great presentation. Fantastic. Thank you for fielding these questions. Should you have more questions, you can type them up here in Q&A, and perhaps Ashley might have some time. I'm not sure if she can stay or not, but thank you so much. And so that concludes then our session here. So we are going to have a raffle quick here one more time, where we have a raffle coming up. So if we can get our slide up. Do we need the slide up? We don't necessarily need the slide. It's raffle time. And so I have the honor of announcing who that is, and it's me. No, just kidding. I wish. That would be really great, but you wouldn't really know which. I want one of these books really badly. The winner is Kim McDonald. So congratulations, Kim, and sorry if I stole your thunder. You won the raffle. Fantastic. We'll be back here at 2:45, so see you soon.